Hey y'all, Dr. Kat here for our next transmission. As I mentioned in our last group meeting, I will be reading the next chapter or two of our book, The Kin of Ada Are Waiting for You by Dorothy Bryant, which I started a few transmissions ago. So if you haven't heard the first part, go ahead and search back maybe it's around 12 or something like that, for the first chapter, or if you need to brush up, go ahead and visit that again if you feel inclined to. Otherwise, perhaps you're just meant to listen to this excerpt. Who knows? Ask your higher self, not me. Okay, here we go. Chapter 2. From where I sat, I could look straight down upon the village. At the center of it was a great tent rising above the huge old tree. The low stone walls started from the tree, spiraling outward in wider and wider circles. Along the wall, at irregular intervals, were tent domes like the one I stayed in. I counted 12 of them. The stone wall ended abruptly at the last one. Then the spiral continued with the little igloo-type mounds. There were over 20 of them blending outward irregularly into the fields beyond. Then suddenly the whole village disappeared. I blinked and it came back. As I focused and unfocused my eyes upon the village, it alternately melted into scrubby ground and reappeared in its spiral design, like a shifting optical illusion game or an expert work of camouflage. Many people were already up. I saw them come out of their tents and move outward from the spiral. Some of them followed the spiraling path, but many simply hopped over the low stone walls. Beyond the outermost stone walls were piles of sticks and bones. People stopped at these piles to pick up a tool and move outward to the fields, where they began to work in irregularly spaced groups. Others came to the very edge of the fields below me and worked among the trees in the orchards. I sat there the whole day, my mind in suspension, but my senses alert. Some people stayed in the fields nearly all day, while others went back into the village after only a couple of hours. There was constant coming and going in the little igloos outside the village. I'd have thought they were used as some kind of latrines if I hadn't been in one, and if people hadn't stayed so long, at least an hour, during each visit to one. Occasionally I saw a group of workers suddenly stop work and begin to move together in a kind of dance. Sometimes they joined hands in a line, but more often they just faced each other or faced toward the center of the square or circle and did slow, unison movements, bending far backward, swinging their arms in broad waves, stepping low, slow strides. However their movements went, they always stopped the same way, erect, hands at sides, heads thrown back. They would laugh and go back to working in the soil, their work taking on the same rhythmic quality. Children went among them with a bag that must have contained water. They drank, danced, and worked. When the sun was directly overhead, many of them went back to the village. Others lay in the shade of trees or went into the little igloos. In the afternoon, many of them were back at work in the fields again. I heard the sound of bees, of birds calling, of the breeze rustling leaves and grass. When the wind was right, I could hear the faint gushing of an unseen river, and once in the late afternoon, the wind brought me the echo of the ocean waves on some beach out beyond the hill. Mingled with these sounds were the occasional bursts of laughter or singing from the workers in the fields. But the entire day passed without my hearing from them one spoken word. As the sun moved low on the horizon, the hill cast its shadow over the fields nearest me, and the people, one by one, began to stop work and move toward the village. On the far side of the village, where the fields circled almost beyond my sight, to the next hill, I saw the people as little dots moving toward the village. Then I heard a familiar sound, a rattling drone, a whooshing roar. A plane had passed overhead. I looked up into the sky, but I could see nothing. It was flying too high. Already the sound was dying away. As I looked back down into the valley, I saw a frozen scene come back to life. I thought my vision was playing tricks on me, for it seemed that all the people had, for a few seconds, frozen absolutely in the midst of a movement, like a movie that stops to become a still picture and then is animated again. Now that they were in motion again, I felt doubtful that they had stopped at all. While they had left the village in various ways, they all now entered in the same way. From the point where the low stone walls began, they walked the spiral inward in the procession which I had seen daily. They stopped at various tents, then moved onward in the process processing leading to the great central tent. As the sky darkened, the fields and village looked empty, and I knew that they were all in the cone under the great spokes of the uncovered tent, eating. I felt weak and cold. I climbed down the hill, stumbling a couple of times, but not hurting myself. At the foot of the hill, I reached into one of the trees and picked some of the small green plums. I ate them on my way across the fields, and immediately felt stronger. It was quite dark as I reached the stone wall, and clouds hid the moon. So I followed closely along the stone walls rather than stepping over them, following the slow spiral inward as the others had done before me. Keeping one hand on top of the walls, I noticed that they were slightly indented, as if a shallow gutter ran along the top. I imagined that when it rained, the water was caught in those gutters, running inward to fill the pool below the great old tree. When I reached the end of the stone wall, I could see the waters of the pool glistening. The clouds had passed and the night was clear. I splashed some water on my face. Then I bent under the branches of the great tree and found my way to the great tent, where I stood on the edge looking down into the cone. This time, in front of the glowing embers of the fire, there were 10 or 12 children, naked, going through what looked like some kind of dance. They joined hands, circled the fire, extended their hands toward the fire, raised their hands high, then extended these hands toward the people sitting on the first step near them. The people stretched out their hands as if to receive something, then turned and stretched out their hands behind them as if to pass it on. The motion was repeated, step by step, all the way up. Over and over again, the children moved silently through the dance. The arms of the audience swung forward and backward. After a few minutes, I began to feel slightly dizzy at the waves of motion. Then I thought I saw a slight glow in the hands of one of the children. I blinked my eyes, and it was gone. I started to move forward down the steps, but I felt afraid of the mass of waving arms. Finally, I decided to stand on the edge of the cone until the ritual ended. Several times I felt giddy. Several times I thought I saw some shining objects pass from hand to hand in the darkness. The dance ritual didn't really end. It just faded away as one by one the children tired and sat down or lay down or returned to a seat on the steps. The last one held his hand above the fire for a moment, then abruptly sat down. All motion stopped, and there was complete silence. Into that silence I shouted, "Doesn't anyone here speak English?" All heads turned toward me. My shout sounded so stupid that I expected them to laugh, but no one did. The faces I could see in the semi-darkness looked uncertain, then concerned, then welcoming. Arms reached out to me and led me down the steps. Someone stepped forward to stir up the fire, and it flared into brightness. Then Goldilocks stepped forward, squinted his slant eyes at me, and said, "Chilsing," then put his fingers to his chest. He repeated this several times, then looked at me and waited. I touched his chest with one finger and repeated, "Chilsing." He nodded and smiled. Everyone nodded and smiled. Heads were bobbing all around me. They had understood that I wanted to communicate, and they were teaching me their language, starting with names. Hopelessly, I acquiesced. Certainly, I could find out nothing about where I was and what was going to happen to me until I knew how to communicate with them. I pointed to my chest and said my name. There was no response at all. Chilsing just looked at me. Slowly, he shook his head. Everyone else started shaking heads. The motion was eerie, repeated in the darkness all around me. "Idiots, I'm telling you my name." Chilsing put his hand on my shoulder and shrugged as if he wanted to change the subject. I pulled my shoulder away from his grasp. He looked stricken. He bowed his head and murmured something that sounded like an apology. Many of the surrounding people did the same. It was exasperating. "Look," I said, "let's give up on the language lesson for tonight. I'm tired. We're all tired. Let's go to sleep, huh? Tired?" I started going through some gestures of sleep, and they finally caught on. People started getting up, but they stood still in their places until one of the old ones stood up before the fire and chanted something, just a phrase or two. Then she said, "Nagdeo, Nagdeo, Nagdeo." The whole group repeated the word 3 times, and then they started to file out. Chilsing and the bald man waited for me. They started to take my arms, but I shrugged them away. They followed me. Once we got past a tree and the pool, I started shortcutting, stepping over the stone walls, and they followed me. I lost my way and couldn't find our tent until one of them nudged me and led the way. Then I stumbled into the tent, rolled up in my blanket, and fell dead asleep. The next morning, I was up first. The next one up was a black woman. She stood in front of me, reached up her arms, spread them wide, and started to clasp them in front. But I interrupted. I reached forward, pointing to her breast, just short of touching her right nipple, and said, "What's your name?" She looked surprised. I pointed again. "Augustine," she murmured. Then she clasped her hands and began telling me whatever she was telling. I interrupted her, pointed to the framework of the wall, and demanded, "What do you call this?" She paid no attention to me, but finished her incomprehensible recital. Then she looked where I was pointing and said, "Ka." I pointed to the mat covering the framework, to the floor, to the opening, and she simply repeated, "Ka." Then she motioned for me to follow her outside. Others were already on the paths, walking outward. No one hopped the walls, and everyone walked slowly. As they passed trees and bushes, they picked a blossom or a twig. I noticed that several butterflies circled the head of the black woman, and one finally lit on her shoulder. "That's some trick, Augustine," I said. "Will you teach it to me?" She only smiled. We walked single file now, out across the fields and onto a trail through a thick forest. Then we came to a river and walked along its bank until, widening and slowing, the river too became silent. The next sound I heard was that of the sea. We walked past a large rocky mound into the sand and saw and heard the rushing surf, with the sun rising above it. I fell on the sand, too exhausted to move. The people filed past me and walked straight toward the water. On the edge of the water, they pulled off their tunics and left them on the sand. They waited, standing on the edge of the sea, until all were there, standing in a straight line along the edge of the water, naked, facing the rising sun. They each took the leaf or blossom he carried and threw it forward into the water. As their blossoms were carried outward into the receding waves, they joined hands and followed them into the water. When the water reached waist height, I heard squeals and laughter as they began paddling about, washing themselves and one another. They played like any sea bathers on a Sunday afternoon, and in fact I learned later that this was their Sabbath, which came about every 7 days, depending on the weather and the work, and which always started with an ocean bath, even in cold weather, except during the worst of winter. They came out of the water one by one, put on their tunics, and began to organize games and dances on the sand. These went on until the sun was high. Then we started back. I was too tired to make it all the way. Before we reached the fields, the bushy-haired man swooped me up in his arms as if I were a baby. "Subgay," he identified himself as we jogged along. And that's how we entered the village, leading the procession, his little lamb bleating behind us. The rest of the day was spent sitting around the village. Small circles formed around single people, usually old ones, who recited long monologues. I joined one group with Sibgay. Every now and then I would catch a word, repeat it to Sibgay, and challenge him to translate it. By the end of the day I had learned about 20 words, was more confused than before, and only slightly less bored. There is no point in detailing the process of my language lessons. I followed people around throughout the next few days, pointing to things and asking their names. I have always been quick with languages, easily picking up a working knowledge of several. After a few days, I concluded that, judging from their language, these people were so backward as to be a race of mental retardants. The vocabulary I heard was small and general. I understood that ka meant dwelling, place, or tent, but all parts of the ka were simply referred to as ka. Similarly, there was a word for food, and anything edible was called by that word, with no differentiation. All trees, bushes, plants, anything that grew had one name. All stones of whatever color or type had one name. All animals had one name, even birds and insects were included in it. And the same word, which was only a slightly elongated form of the word for plants, meant people too. I couldn't see how they could communicate anything at all with a language of such poverty. And of course, they didn't communicate much with words. They seemed to try to avoid speaking as much as possible, using gestures when they needed to tell someone something. This hampered me a great deal because although they would speak when I demanded to know a word, would answer any question I asked, it was really impossible to engage them in a conversation. The younger ones were less taciturn. I began to spend a lot of time with Chilsing and some of the children. In fact, I developed quite a following. They were willing to talk, and I got them to the point where they would chatter for minutes at a time until some adult came and quietly led them away. That made me believe that the older ones were trying to hide something from me. For all their smiling and all their care of me, they were holding back. I felt sure of it. Otherwise, why would they take the children away after they had talked to me for a while? What were they afraid the children would tell me? In a few weeks I knew all of the poor vocabulary they used every day, but I could still not understand much of what they said upon awakening in the morning, nor much of what was said around the fire in the lakka, the big tent, at night. I only caught a word here and there in these long speeches, which contained a large vocabulary of words saved up, as it were, for the occasion. I intently watched and listened every night in the lakka. I felt that it was here, in the long monologue, that I would learn the subtleties of their language, if any existed. But more than that, I was intrigued with what I saw. The second time the children acted out their little fire drama or dance, I watched more closely, and this time I was sure that what they passed from hand to hand were rubies. Another children's drama took place to spoken words, a chant, the first of the stories told in the lakka, whose words I was able to understand. It was simple enough. We seek. All seek. Where? Where? As the chant was repeated, a child danced up and down the steps, making motions as if she were hunting for something among the people, while the other children stood behind the fire chanting. When the child reached the top step, the chanter shouted, "There!" "Where?" "In you!" I looked up to see the child's mouth open wide with joy, and between her teeth I saw a pearl as big as an egg. Then some quick sleight of hand, and it was gone. That night, as we left the lakka, I stopped Augustine and said, "You live a very hard, simple life by day, but at night you display your treasures in the lakka." She smiled and nodded. "Is there more than I have seen?" She turned to face me. This time, she did not smile. Much more. I could not read her expression. I decided that these people were a mixture of subtlety and stupidity. They obviously knew the value of the precious gems I had glimpsed, and they prized them, but only as a decoration to their stories and rituals, not as a means for improving their material condition. Could it be possible that they did not know the monetary value of them? That seemed unlikely, yet I saw no sign so far that they had any contact, or had ever had any contact with my world. I suspected them of trying to avoid contact, of hiding their existence. Why? To keep from having their treasure stolen? Yet, without contact with the outside world, how could they know that anyone would want to steal the precious stones? I saw no sign of any mining on the island. When I asked where the precious stones came from, I was greeted with blank stares. Communication was still difficult, and I gave up in frustration at their ignorance or reticence, whichever it might be. Whatever they were hiding, I felt sure I would find out before long from such simple people. I remember thinking at that time that it was appropriate they should call themselves by the same word they gave to animals. They seemed hardly more than animals in their simplicity and lack of human consciousness. As I went on learning the language, I ran into several difficulties. Their verbs lacked tense. Literally, as they spoke, there was no sense of past or future, only of now, the present moment. That's why it would be impossible, if not boring, but surely confusing for my reader if I tried to translate directly any talks I had with them. And the reader must understand that, as I report future talks, when I knew the language better, I must distort these talks to fit a language into which what they said really cannot be translated. The language lacked all sense of the singular, the individual, but what most struck me, next to the lack of a sense of time, was its inconsistency of gender. Everything animate and inanimate was either masculine or feminine. Nothing was neuter, except human beings. I'd never encountered anything like this in any other language. And it was no accident, but a reflection of the way they lived. Great care was taken to pair masculine and feminine objects in planting or arranging things. I would have said that no people could be more constantly concerned with sex. Yet I never heard anyone referred to by pronouns of gender, no he or she. There were words for man and woman, but they were almost never used. I have already mentioned similarity of work between the sexes and similarity of clothing. Ornaments too were worn by both sexes. There seemed to be only one consistent rule or custom about ornaments. People might put a flower or a woven necklace on someone else, then stand back to enjoy the effect. But I never saw anyone decorate himself or herself or show any sign of concern for appearance. Ornaments, like food, were to be given to others. One pronoun referred to all human beings. People called to one another by this word when not using someone's name, or they referred to one or more people by it. It was both singular and plural, and it meant kinship. The way most people use the word brother would be the closest word in English, but because brother implies gender and singularity, it is quite wrong. The closest word I can think of to approximate the meaning of this pronoun is kin. We were all called kin. But as soon as I started feeling better, I had something else besides language on my mind. I remember thinking at the time that every island paradise in the books I'd read or written, one of the spy stories actually did take place partially on a South Pacific island, always contained plenty of plump, brown, willing females. I couldn't make up my mind about this place. I just have to put a side note in here as I'm reading. I'm cringing multiple times because of this narrator, which is also why I skipped the very first part of this book. It was also cringeworthy. But I hope that you're also getting the bigger picture out of this. I do think that his ignorance will likely enlighten as the book goes along. But I just want to point out that I'm cringing. And I wonder if you are too. And if you are, I'm sorry. And I hope you're taking it for the wisdom and entertainment that it's meant to be. Okay, continuing on. Whew. So he rapes Augustine. Even lying in that dirt sheet had a kind of dignity I couldn't touch. I felt that I was the one who'd been humiliated. She looked steadily up at me, shook her head slowly, and said, Nagdeo. Her eyes flashed angrily, and she shook her head as if to clear it, got up quickly, brushing the dirt off her tunic, and hurried away. Almost running, she pulled off her tunic as she hurried across the field to a holka. She dropped the tunic on the ground and crawled inside. I watched for a long time, but she didn't come out. When she ran away, I'd assumed she was going to tell the others, and that they would gang up on me again. I'd been warned once. This time I thought they'd hurt me. I believe I'd probably bring the whole village down on me. But nothing happened. A couple of hours later, she was back in the fields working, moving in light dance-like steps as she stirred the ground with her hands and feet, loosening the dirt around a plant. No one seemed to notice me as I walked across the field, wandered through the orchards, then back toward the village again. I stopped in front of a holka. There was a small mound of clay and rocks like an igloo with a crawl tunnel leading into it. The entrance was covered by a mat. Just outside the entrance I saw a tunic folded neatly on the ground. Evidently people entered a holka naked, but what did they do there? I walked a few yards to the next holka. There was no tunic outside, no sign that the place was occupied. I looked around. No one was close by. I pulled off my tunic and crawled in. The short tunnel was narrow. I had to fall on my belly and move forward on my elbows. Then the tunnel went sharply downward. The place was actually a hole in the ground, covered with a rock and a clay roof. It was completely dark inside, and there was enough height to kneel but not to stand. By the earthy smell, I recognized this as the place where I'd awakened after the accident, or at least one like this. I felt around the sides and top. Nothing. It was quite bare except for mats on the ground. I sat down on a mat. I sat still for about 10 minutes, and then the place got to me. I was overcome with claustrophobic panic, and I frantically felt the walls until I found the opening. I crawled out too quickly and scraped my shoulders, emerging head first and blinking into the bright sunlight. As I poked my head out, someone was passing by. It was the bald man who hadn't spoken to me since he'd caught me with Augustine. He smiled at me, nodding approval, and said, Nagdeo. I was sick of the sound of the word. I put on my tunic and straggled along the circular path, letting it take me inward toward the center of the village. Along the path there were children and old people tending plants and bushes which grew along the stone walls. Others sat weaving grass. Someone was always weaving grass into tunics, blankets, cups, or mats. Some of them smiled and nodded as I passed. Others remained absorbed in their work, silently, except for the occasional babble of a child, which was usually answered with a gesture by an adult. I looked a little more closely at the walls as I slowly walked by. At first I thought they were covered with undifferentiated weeds, wild ivy, and lichens, but now I saw there was too much variety for the growth to have occurred naturally. I knew very little about plants and flowers, having always considered any interest in them the province of lonely senile women, like the collecting of cats, but I was able to recognize some simple herbs like sage and a species of thyme. I could see that the plants growing on and near the low stone walls were an incredible variety, almost no one like another, that they were being carefully tended by people who were too young or too old to do much work in the fields. As I was looking at a plant, Chilsing came past me. I caught his arm and pointed to the herb. He spoke a word. Then I pointed to another herb, and he spoke the same word. I shook my head, pointing to one and the other as he repeated the word. Then suddenly he grinned and nodded and gave me two entirely different words. We sat down in the middle of the path and began to talk. It would serve no purpose to describe this session of gestures, sounds, frustrations, charades. In fact, it would be impossible to explain all the ways in which I finally conveyed my meaning to Chilsing and how he answered me. This was the first of the really searching conversations, or call them lessons, we had, and how he communicated cannot be literally translated to English. Even after I became fluent in the Ata language, I found it impossible to translate directly into English for many of the reasons which I have already outlined, and others besides. All talk which follows must be seen as a crude approximation of what we were able to communicate at the various stages of my understanding. I can tell you how the breakthrough in this understanding came during this session with Chilsing. I spoke in English with gestures and then, for no reason in particular, switched to words in other languages, whatever words I knew, and I discovered that some of the words in English were close enough to the Ata word to be understood. The same was true of words in Spanish, German, and the bit of Greek I knew. Over half of the words Chilsing used were completely inexplicable to me, and I somehow held the conviction that these words came from Asian or African languages that were utterly foreign to me. I asked him if this were true, and he shrugged and said he did not know. The following dialogue is a condensation in English of what actually took nearly 4 hours to communicate in the first real conversation I held. What is this island? Ata. Where is it? It is Ata. No, in what part of the world? In the center of the world. But near what country? Near Mexico? Near Europe? Where? I cannot say anything of countries. Ata is the center of the world. How did I get here? Why you came is unknowable. Not why, how? They are the same. Where did I come from? Who brought me here? He was silent at this question and looked at me for a while before he said, Only you can answer that. What do you mean? I don't know who brought me here. It was an accident. I woke up here. He shook his head at me. No one comes without seeking. You could not come here unless you wanted to. Where did you find me? On the shore. On the shore of the ocean? Where? He pointed toward the east, toward the beach where the sunrise bath took place every 6 to 9 days. Who found me? I did, and Salvatore. That was the bald man's name. How did you happen to find me? We were looking for you. You expected me? Yes. How did you know I was coming? Augustine knew. How did she know? Who told her? Nagdeo. I thought Nagdeo was a greeting, like good morning. It is. But you say it is a person? I don't know. Who is he? Where can I find him and talk to him? At this, Chilsing just laughed, and despite our continued talking, I could not make any sense of his earnest attempts to explain the word to me. How did you come here? I was born here. But the others, did they come from other places as I did? Chilsing shook his head, then looked uncertain. Some had, but not very many. It is hard to come here, as you know. They must have, I told him. That explains why your language contains words borrowed from other languages. At that, Chilsing laughed. Oh no, he said. Oh no. Explain yourself. What do you mean? I don't know. I cannot explain. His young face looked puzzled. I am not very wise yet. If you listen in the Laka at night, you will soon learn all the answers to your questions. Is your treasure kept in the Laka? Treasure? The riches of your people, the precious ornaments used in the dances. Oh, yes, he frowned as if uncertain. Our treasure is kept in Laka. He pushed back his golden curls and looked apologetic. But please, I would please like to stop talking now. Why? What are you hiding? Why are you such a silent people? Is there a taboo against talking? It took a long time to explain the word taboo to him, and even then he did not understand the word, could not seem to imagine what it meant. No, there is no taboo. Nothing is taboo. He looked quite shocked and puzzled, unable to assimilate the concept of something forbidden. Then why do you all remain so silent? Talking too much is Don Nagdeo. He grinned and backed off from me. I saw him hop the stone walls and hurry toward the holcus, pulling off his tunic as he ran. I sat down on the path and leaned against the wall, closing my eyes and thinking. I must have dozed off. When I woke up a half hour or so later, he was walking past me, arm in arm with Augustine. It was sunset. When they saw me, they stopped to wait for me. I got up, my eyes meeting Augustine's. Hers looked neutral and serene. I moved as though to walk behind them, but they made a space between them, and we walked three abreast in silence as usual. Then Augustine began to hum softly, and Chilsing joined her. Others walking behind us joined in, rather absent-mindedly, immediately breaking into rich harmonies, which died off into whispers. We stopped at the pool and scooped water up to our faces, rubbed our hands together and sprinkled what was left on the tree roots as we ducked under the branches of the great tree. A few people were already in the center of the cone near the fire, feeding one another from the pots. Others were carrying in bits of fruit. A child came up to me and stuck a sprig of sage in my hair. It was all very friendly and loving and gay, and completely frustrating to me. There was not very much food, and it took a long time to pass it around in this playful way. I would have been glad for a stiff drink and a cigarette. I'd read somewhere that every culture in the world has always discovered some method of intoxication, be it hemp or alcohol. I wondered if these bastardized rejects of various cultures, for that is how I now saw them, had not even reached a sufficient level of culture to be able to get drunk. I sulked, I suppose, letting people bring me bites of food, but offering none in return. Hurry up, I told them. Let's get on with it. They understood me, but went on, as they were doing, until everyone stopped eating and was seated. People tended to sit according to their ages. The infants were held by boys and girls, down in the center of the cone near the fire. Behind them sat slightly older children. Chilsing among them, and behind them adults. Augustine sat in the back near the top of the cone, her head resting against one of the beams that pointed to the sky. The very oldest people were carried down to sit near the fire with the infants. Salvatore sat with his eyes half closed near the fire. The blackbird flew to the top of the tent poles, then glided downward in sweeps above the heads of the people as they quieted down. When they were quiet, it landed on Salvatore's shoulder, and Salvatore began to speak. What I reproduce here is my limping translation of what he said. It lacks purity and directness of the Atta language, and also its complexity, which was revealed only in these sessions, never in the language of other everyday acts. But I had finally broken through, and although the story I give here was a version arrived at after much work, I understood the sense of the story, got most of the words at that first hearing. Nagdeo without beginning, Nagdeo without end, Nagdeo forever, our home. At the end of each phrase, the people repeated a word or two, but I will leave out these responses. But the day came when a piece of the sun fell to the ocean. It fell and floated on the ocean. It separated itself into earth and water and plants and animals. It was no longer sun, but each of its parts was a part of the sun and a sign of the sun. And all parts, earth and water and plants and animals, were content in their division, content in their expression of the sun, content to be a single part multiplying itself under the light of the sun, striving in being as a sign of the sun, but never true sun, lost to the form of the true sun. I could see the lips of the people moving in silent imitation. They all knew the story by heart. Until the single multiple signs formed the human part, and the human part of the sun was not content. The human part suffered, because within it was the knowledge of the fall from the sun and the yearning to return. It knew and it did not know. It suffered and yearned. It suffered and yearned for what it did not know. And out of its suffering and yearning grew the cry of the people, yearning to know the way back to the sun. And the sun took pity on the people, and when they fell asleep, the sun shone through the sleep and lit up the world of sleep and showed them the way. In silent light of sleep, the people saw that there was a law of gravity, there was also a law of light, and that the law of light was stronger than the law of gravity. And the people obeyed the light of sleep, and they kept the light within them, and stood in the light of sleep, both waking and sleeping, until the light surrounded them and filled them, and they became the light. And as the sun shone on them, they shone back, and were lifted as light, and shot as rays of light. And gravity was overcome, and the people of light returned to the sun, where they shine and flame eternally. I had been listening with my eyes closed, concentrating on the words. I opened my eyes. Salvatore stood in front of the fire. The spokes of a gold crown radiated from his head with almost blinding glow. Then with a quick motion, and the crown was gone. Then a quick motion, and the crown was gone. Eternally, repeated the people. Then they all rose, said Nagdeo, 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 and began to leave the tent. The next day I approached Salvatore. He absolutely refused to discuss the gold crown. His face remained blank when I spoke of it. Did you understand what you heard last night? He asked. Yes, I said contemptuously. I understand that you worship the sun, a common thing among primitive people. He looked at me, but said nothing. And you believe dreams are real happenings, isn't that right? He nodded. Do you know, I said as he picked up a half-finished mat and started weaving, that the sun is only a star, like all the other stars you see in the sky at night? There are millions of suns and millions of planets all spinning around the suns, and I wish that my knowledge of astronomy were greater. The old man listened to me and said nothing. You really believe that man's distinguishing characteristic is his desire to return to the sun? The sun is a ball of fire. If this planet moved a bit closer to it, we'd all be burned up. He nodded. Then why do you cling to these senseless myths? He didn't answer. I decided there was really no point in attacking him on these grounds, but rather on the question of dreams. Yours is a life based on delusion and hallucination, I began. But he looked so sad and depressed at these words that I gave up for the rest of the day. In the morning, when everyone in our car got up and began the recital of what they had dreamed the night before, in the world of sleep lit by the sun, I interrupted them with a little recital of my own. Dreams, I said, are not real, like this is real. I touched my arm and then hit one of the branches of the ka. They are hallucinations, mental enactments of desires. Dreams are the guardian of sleep. You dreamed of a plum because you were hungry. You dreamed I was pulling your leg off because the bruise on your leg aches where you bumped into the wall yesterday. Yes, that is perhaps true, said Chilsing. But you believe in these dreams. You think they are reality? Yes, they are reality. But they happen only in your head. There is little point in repeating the endless arguments with which I started every morning. There was no question about it, no doubt at all, that for these people, reality consisted of dreams and their waking life was an illusion. They had reversed everything. At one point, in exasperation, I slapped Chilsing hard across the face and said, Look, isn't that real? My real hand hit your real face, and it really hurt. Yes, it hurt, said Chilsing, but that does not matter. What matters is that it is Nagdeo for you to be angry and hit me. The translation of the word was quite clear now, although there is, of course, no such word in English or any other language. The word Nagdeo, which is a greeting, a prayer, a benediction, whatever, roughly meant something like good dreams, but not really that. It was something more like valuable dreams or enlightening dreams. To call something Nagdeo was to say it was not productive of good, valuable, or enlightening dreams. dreams which showed the way back to the sun. All kinds of things were Nagdeo. Anger was Nagdeo, so was eating too much or not eating enough, or talking too much. The list grew and grew. But beyond that, every act had become ritualized to serve the dramas of their dream life, which in turn dictated their waking life. The very plan of the village had occurred in a dream of someone long ago. No one could remember when. He pointed out to Chilsing that everyone walked at least an extra mile getting to the Laka because of the circular paths. But he said that is how the dream said it should be done, and it would remain that way unless superseded by another very strong dream. If your dream told you to kill me, would you do it? I demanded. It would not tell me to do that. Why? How do you know? To kill is Nagdeo. It would not tell me to do what is Nagdeo. My dreams do. In my dreams I must kill dark things that... I stopped. I had no intention of joining the morning ritual of telling my dreams. Chilsing looked at me uncertainly. You told me, I said, that there were no taboos here. Your whole life is run by the most primitive taboos, the most reactionary and restrictive. No, Chilsing said. Nothing is taboo. But everything is Nagdeo, same thing. No, it is not the same thing. Nothing is forbidden. But who would want to do what is Nagdeo? Who would want to ruin his chance to find the way? How do you know what is Nagdeo? The old ones like Salvador tell you, don't they? They make rules, taboos. Chilsing looked puzzled again. Salvatore is a strong dreamer, a good guide. You see? Taboo. Chilsing shook his head. But each person finds for himself what is Nagdeo. To force someone to do or not to do something is also Nagdeo. Nothing is forbidden, nothing is taboo, but I listen to Salvatore because he is usually right. I nearly exploded with exasperation. If I could only get you to believe that beyond this island there is a fantastic world full of wonders you never could dream of. Places where people don't have to exist on leaves and berries and work all day, where... At this point, Chilsing usually withdrew, but each time I told him, he sounded a bit more curious. Once when I was haranguing him, we heard the roar of an airplane. He froze, and so did everyone else around us. Why did you do that? I asked. So the people in the noisy bird won't see us. How do you know there are people in it? Someone saw them in a dream. And why don't you want them to see you? Someone knew it in a dream. I want to attract the attention of a plane so that it will come and get me and take me off this island and back to civilization. Would you stop me? Chilsing bit his lip. We would watch you as we watched you when you tried to force Augustine. And if I didn't stop? To force you would be Nagdeo, but I think they fly too high to see you anyway. Then why do you freeze to avoid being seen? Habit, he said. Let me tell you something, I said. If we could attract the attention of that plane, we could get food and clothes and thousands of things you never dreamed of. And you wouldn't have to work in the fields all day to have them. And at night you wouldn't sit on the hard steps of Laka and watch the repetition of some old story. You could enjoy plays and pictures that would make your dreams seem pale. You could trade the treasure of the Laka for many things. Why don't Salvatore and the other old ones tell you this? Why should I lie to you about it? You know I'm telling the truth. They don't want you to learn about the outside world because they'd lose control of this one. Day after day I kept at him. I figured that the only ones I could get to were the young ones. The older ones were completely set and unapproachable, and I would need help if I were to ever manage to get away from here. I thought Augustine must be a key figure in all of this, but it was a long time before I felt I could approach her. Finally, one day I did. She had come back early from the fields and was walking along the path, her eyes fixed in a faraway look that told me she was thinking over her latest dream. I stepped out in front of her. She stopped and faced me without any expression. I want to talk to you, I said. She nodded, and we sat down on the stone wall under a fig tree. I'm sorry for what I did, I began. She nodded. You should go to the Holka, she said, just to be sure. Sure of what? It would help you. How? I don't understand. It feels to me like a tomb. The Holka is to help us when we have gone very far from Nagdeo, or when we are afraid we might. There we go naked back into our mother. and you come out reborn. And begin again, she smiled. I go often. Yes, every day I notice. Because I so often stumble, I am so far from... Nonsense, I told her. You've got some kind of puritanical obsession with... Then I wasted an hour trying to explain what I meant by puritanical. She just kept smiling and shaking her head. It's that you feel guilty because I raped you, and another hour on guilt. I was practically yelling when I finally said, You people are imprisoned by your superstitions. And she only shrugged and said, Perhaps. I can't get any of you to argue with me. Arguing is, don't tell me, the Nagdeo. She laughed and nodded. I was tired and irritable like a sulking child. I really wanted to ask you about the dream that told you I would come here. Please tell me that dream, every detail of it. It was sunset, and we got up to walk to the laka. She put her arm through mine and told me as we walked, keeping her eyes straight ahead as if she read her words in the air before us. I was walking on the beach. I walked back and forth on the sand, looking out to sea, watching for the sunrise. Behind me stood all the people of Ata, and behind them stood many, many more people who were not of Ata. All looked out to sea. They were waiting for something. We all waited. The sea turned red, a dark earth red, and from the sea came a great cry, a howl from a creature, not human. I could see the creature in the red waves. It was a terrible, monstrous beast. I was afraid, but I knew what I must do. I waded out into the rust-colored sea. I waded further and further out to where the monster thrashed and howled, and when I came close, the monster reached out and grasped me. It tried to pull me into the deep red sea, but I kept my eyes on the sun rising out of the Red Sea behind the monster, and tightly as it gripped me, I began to inch backward toward the shore. The monster howled and tightened its grip, but I kept my eyes on the rising sun, and I kept stepping back to the shore, inch by inch. Finally, I reached dry sand, just as the sun emerged from the water. I fell in the sand, and the thing gripping me fell upon me. In the light of the risen sun, I looked and saw that it was no longer a monster, but a man. He rose up, and the people of Ata, still standing on the beach, said, Welcome. We have been waiting for you. And from the head of the man came a bright light, like the rays of the sun. The man turned his head to look at us, and turned the bright light upon us, lighting up the people of Ata so that they could be seen by the many people who stood behind. I waited for her to go on, but she was through. You dreamed of a man who tried to pull you into a rust-red sea. How long before I came since you lay with a man? She looked at me. A long time. I thought her pathetic, a striking woman, but no longer young. It had been a long time since anyone had taken her into the orchard. You dreamed this dream because you wanted to lie with a man. Perhaps, she said, refusing to argue. We walked on quietly for a while. Then she said, After I had dreamed the dream 3 times, I told it in the laka, as is our custom. And so it became official dogma. Dogma? Never mind. You told your dream, and then you found me. There is no connection. In the dream, she said, I saw the face of the man in the sunlight. It was your face. And you sure you didn't dream this after you found me? Sure, she said. I waited for you. So you believe your dream brought me here? No. Oh, no, she said. No one can bring you here. You must want it with your whole soul. You wanted it. I did not. You cried from the depths of yourself to come here. She looked at me admiringly. Still, it is not easy. You must be a very strong dreamer. We had arrived at the pool. She bent low, scooped up water to sprinkle on herself and on the tree, and disappeared under the branches. We ate in the usual way and then sat down. That night the storyteller was a younger one, a boy who had just begun to wear a tunic. He sat down beside the fire, waited for everyone to be quiet, then cleared his throat and began. A boy lived for many years in a ka. Every day he wanted to look upon the sun, but he could not, for to look directly at the sun would make him blind. Instead, when the sun went down, the boy looked at the moon, which had taken a bit of the sun's light, enough to show to the boy what he must do. When the boy rose in the morning, he said to his kin, The moon brings a message from the sun, which is that I must find my mother and my father. Are you my mother? Are you my father? The people of his ka answered that they were not. So the boy left his ka. All day long he walked through the village, through the orchards, over the hill, beside the river, and down to the ocean, asking every woman he saw, Are you my mother? And every man, Are you my father? Finally, a woman and a man answered, Out of our bodies came yours. And the boy said, Then you are my mother and father. But the man and woman shook their heads. And the boy said, How will I find my mother and my father? And the man and the woman said, You must travel a long way by the light of both the sun and the moon, and sometimes there will be neither sun nor moon, but only darkness. Yet you must not fear the darkness, because it too can tell you things. Never rest in your search until... At this point I got up from my seat. I was about midway up in the cone. By the time I had walked down to the fire, the boy's voice was stilled and all the people were looking at me. Augustine had a dream about me, I started. She dreamed I came out of the sea and that all of you were waiting for me. I paused and waited, but there was no reaction aside from a few nods. She dreamed that from my head a great light came shining on all of you. Again I waited and people leaned forward. Now I should tell you what that light was. It was the light of reason, the great light of mankind. It meant that I was sent here to make a light in the darkness in which you have lived for so long, a light that would drive out superstition and teach you reality, a light to take you out of your dreams. At that, there was a sharp murmur from some of the people, but many of the children watched me, fascinated. I come from a place where men fly in the air, not only in their dreams, but in real life. You have seen them. A place where food is so sweet and rich and varied that none of your dreams could contain it, and where most people do not need to labor in the fields to get it. It is a place full of waking wonders, real wonders that remain, that are solid and permanent, not the fantasies and hallucinations of dreams. And I want to go back there. Who wants to go with me? I do, piped a couple of the smallest children, but from the older people came a kind of mass groan. You are told in this boy's dream to seek your true mother and father. How do you know that your true mother and father are not out there in my world? How do you know that the old people of Atta are not trying to keep you from finding your true mother and father? Out there, away from this island, in the great world, are 1,000 times Atta, the whole population of Atta many times over. And their things are real, and people do not live on fantasies. People were getting up and leaving. I imagined them running to the holkas. Look at them, I said, running to hide in a hole in the ground because I try to tell them about the larger world. One of the children laughed. I saw Augustine standing up near the top of the cone. She was as still as a statue. I could not see her face. I did not want to see even her figure standing over me. When I looked at her, all of my self-righteous determination ebbed out of me and left me empty. For, of course, I was lying. It was easy to talk about bringing the blessings of so-called civilization to Atta. Atta would probably gain a jet strip, a gambling casino, and a set of slums from which these people could go out each day to serve the tourists. It could even become another Navy base. If the people were not so ignorant, I thought, nor so reluctant to argue, they could easily have made my little speech sound ridiculous. My real plan was to get possession of the precious stones and metals they used in their rituals and return to the world with a new name, a new identity, and plenty to live on for the rest of my life. But I couldn't do it alone. I needed help, and I would have to promise something to get that help. I kept talking. You are being held prisoners of superstition. Follow me, and I will save you. Soon all had left but about 15 children. Chilsing was the oldest. I sent 5 away who were too little to be of any use. How far are we from the nearest land? I asked. There are some other islands to the west, answered the boy who had told the story. No, I mean a continent, a large piece of land. All the children looked blank. Have you never seen ships? What about airplanes? You know what they are. Did none of them ever land here? The children shook their heads. I want to leave here, I told them. I want to go back to the great land. If you help me, I will take you with me. They spoke all at once, assuring me that they wanted to go and would help me. It will mean you're going against the older ones, I warned them. You have to disobey them. We can do what we want, said Chilsing. There are no taboos here. Tomorrow we will begin, I said. I thought it best to say nothing about the treasure yet. The children cheered. I looked up. Augustine was still standing high above us. Then she turned and disappeared over the rim of the cone. The children and I slept in the laka. The next morning we began a thorough exploration of the island. It took us about 5 days and revealed nothing of any interest. The only beach was the one used for bathing. Around the rest of the island were cliffs. We spent some time on the beach, wading out nearly half a mile at low tide, calculating how to build a boat to take us away from the island. It seems laughable, but it was a sign of my nearly total derangement that I seriously considered such a thing. I, a perfect example of a modern man, who knew no more than where to press the starter of my car. I was going to build a boat and put it out to sea. Of course, I had no intention of taking the children with me. There were virtually no tools of any kind except for digging sticks and bones. After a few days of lashing together fallen logs with braided grass, I gave up the idea and watched while the children played in the surf on the raft we produced. The only answer was to attract the attention of a passing airplane. The children and I started signal fires on top of the hill and on other rises all over the island. But the fires always went out quickly, whether through lack of attention or through being put out by the older people, I wasn't sure. Occasionally, I carefully brought up the question of the treasure. The children seemed confused about what I meant, but were not averse to taking anything I wanted along with us. No one seemed to be paying any attention to us. Everything went on as usual. Grain and legumes were being harvested and root vegetables planted. Food was prepared for storage on the steps of the laka. A few steps were already full. The days were shorter and the air crisper. Every evening, the usual procession of the laka took place. The usual eating, singing, and dream-telling took place. The children and I always waited until everyone had left. Then we came in and finished the food. They always had left some for us, while I told stories of electric lights, subways, ice cream, and television. We continued to sleep in the laka because I was afraid that, for all their seeming gentleness, the people might try to hurt me if it were necessary to prevent my leaving. Here, with my 10 hostages around me, I felt safe. The children slept fitfully, often starting and moaning. I slept little, if at all. Okay, guys, I'm going to stop there. We're more than an hour in. There's more than 10 pages left in chapter 2. So that's where we will break for now. And when I feel so called, we will continue this very interesting book. All right. I hope you have an excellent day, evening, morning, afternoon, night, wherever you are right now. And I send lots of love and blessings your way from above.